Hey guys, welcome back to Kristen Johnson Ministries. Today's Teaching Tuesday, and I am continuing my study in the book of Acts. So can you believe it? We only have one more chapter after this week, and then we are finished with the study in the book of Acts. And I know I've said this before, the book of Acts is such an amazing book. And the Bible, it's not just about reading it, picking up a chapter every day. It is honestly making it a reality in your life, but not only being a hearer of the word, becoming a doer, going out and being like the early church, spreading the gospel, sharing God's love, sharing all his promises, laying hands on the sick and seeing them recover. Those are the mighty and great things that the book of Acts shares. And so today we're going to look at Acts 27. There's 44 verses in this chapter, and we're just going to talk through it. Paul is finally on his way to Rome. He's sailing to Rome. And remember, God had warned Paul and said, you've shared the gospel in Jerusalem, you will have to go to Rome and share the gospel. And 27 chapters later, Paul is finally on his way to Rome. So let's have a look at it, okay? So it says, and when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. So we have Julius, a centurion, who is now looking after Paul and other prisoners. And entering into a ship of, this is when the words get a little bit harder, Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coast of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. So what is it saying here up to verse 4? It mentions that another Christian from Thessalonica was on the ship, and it says that Julius, the centurion, was giving Paul favor. He was being kind to him. It says in the Amplified version that he had a unique kindness or unusual kindness that he was being shown. And that's what happens when you're under the covering and the covenant of God. You have unexplainable favor, and you see that all with Paul. And so Paul is allowed to go into his friends to refresh himself. You don't hear of the other prisoners having that liberty and freedom. And so anyway, it goes on to say, and when we launched from there, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. So, and when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. They're making their way. Sometimes when you think about the travel, especially in the year 2022, you don't think of having to stop at so many different places from Greece just to get to Rome, that you're going to have to stop and find ships or all the rest of it. But it wasn't as straightforward back then, right? And so they're having to stop at different places and find different ships sailing to Italy because they're heading to Rome. And then it goes on to say, and when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over us against Sindis, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salmon. And hardly passing it, it came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea. Verse 9, now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. So what's happening is they're sailing and they're trying to make their way to Italy, but they are faced with some serious wind, right? And starting to get a little bit dangerous. And now it says, Paul admonished them and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. So Paul is giving them what? A word of wisdom. A word of wisdom is showing what is going to happen. Like he can foresee what is going to happen, not through himself, but God is showing him what is going to happen. And so basically at that time they were getting some wind, but nothing too crazy. When we read on, we'll see that the centurion seeks advice from who? The owner of the ship and the sailor, to say, what do you think? Should we go or not? And so let's see what he says. It says in verse 11, nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. So he believed the owner of the ship and the sailor more than what Paul had spoken. But we have to remember, Paul was not speaking from himself. Paul was speaking from God. And God has all knowledge. He knows all things and what's going to happen, right, in the future, even before we know it. And so therefore, they should have really listened to Paul. But it goes on to say in verse 12, and because the haven was not commodious to winter in the more, part advised to depart thence also, if by any means they might attain to Phoenix, and there to winter, which is an haven of Crete, and lieth toward the southwest and northwest. Basically saying the ship wasn't meant for the winter, it's not going to cope, so you better go now or else you're not going to make it. And so verse 13, and when the south wind blew softly, so they sailed off and it was softly going. And a lot of the times you are unable to see the storm that's about to come, right? It never just crushing and shaking the place. It comes softly. And so it says, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. Verse 14, but not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. And so I'm going to say in my amplified words, or my version, shortened, summarized version, is a ferocious wind came and started to shake their ship. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. And so they are struggling massively. Paul had forewarned them through God, through a prophecy from God, advising them what was about to happen for the future. They didn't listen, and now they're in this serious storm. And they're having to fight with the winds and the wind that's coming, the waters. You know, you can imagine like trying to keep the ship afloat. But anyway, it goes on to say, which when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. And we being exceedingly tossed with a tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. So they were throwing things over the ship, overboard, because why? Because they were afraid that the ship would tip because they were so heavy, or they had too many things on board, so they started to lighten the ship. Verse 19, and the third day, so after 3 days of dealing with this is still going, we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, so no small wind, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. So they are at like the lowest of low. You can imagine the lowest point. No stars, no light, no sun, just pure darkness and harsh winds. I can only imagine how scary that was. And you know, I love God. I trust God. You remember like when Peter stepped on the water and he was like, God, do you not love me? Like, what's happening? That was a small amount of wind. Or when they were sleeping in the boat or wind came. That was nothing in comparison to what is being described here. And so when they've lost all hope and they haven't seen any sun or any stars or any light, verse 21 says, but after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, sirs, you should have listened to me, and not have, hold on one second, loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. So basically, you should have listened to me. We shouldn't have sailed from Crete, because we wouldn't have been impacted by this harm and loss of items on the ship. And he says, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer. What's exhort? Exhort is when you get a prophecy, which is, and it's to exhort and to lift people up, right? So now he says, and now I exhort you to be of good cheer, For there shall be no loss of any man's life among you. How does he know this? Only through God. Or else how would he be able to say that? And so he says, there will be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. So he's basically saying, no one will die, but the ship is going to go. It's not going to last. And he says, for there stood by me this night the angel of God, whom I serve. Whose I am and who I serve. So the God that I am, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. So the angel came and said, Paul, don't worry, you have to go to Caesar, and all that are with you are going to be saved. And that's basically God showing his power, his authority, and his grace, because he saved every single person on that ship, is what he's saying. Every single person is going to be saved. And there were over 200 people on that ship. It wasn't a small ship. It was a lot of people that could have died. And so it goes on to say, wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God that it shall be even as it was told to me. So Paul says, be happy, be grateful, because I believe the word that was given to me from the angel, and I believe what God has said, it's going to happen. There's no doubt, there's no fear, there's no panic. He believes without a shadow of doubt. There's faith. Howbeit, we must cast upon a certain island. But when the 14th night, so 14 nights had come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. So they're trying to figure out how deep is the water. And as it was getting lower and lower and lower, they felt like they were getting closer to land. And so it says, then fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. And so they were worried that they were going to catch the ship on rocks, and so they started to put the anchor down. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let the boat into the sea under colour, as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship. So some of the sailors were trying to escape. But Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, if these individuals, I'm going to put it in my own words because it says, except these abide in the ship. So if these guys don't stay in the ship, we will not all be saved. So everyone has to remain in the ship. They cannot go off and try and save themselves. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. So they were trying to escape in a little boat, but they cut it off when the centurion found out, and they listened to Paul because they believed in Paul's God whom he served. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that you have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing. So for 14 days, they hadn't eaten anything. He's saying you need to eat because you need to be strong for what we're about to go through. And so he says, wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. So he's confirming what God is saying, and he's continuing to exhort them, to give them faith and courage to trust in what God has said. Not one hair is going to fall from you. Can you imagine? You've been shipwrecked. You've been fighting for 14 days. You haven't eaten. You haven't seen any sun, no stars, nothing. Pitch black. You're going through ferocious winds. And, Paul is saying not one hair is going to touch you. Like not one hair is going to be touched on your head. That's a powerful statement when you really put it into context. And then it goes on to say, and when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then they were all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. So they were all happy. And we were all in the ship, 260 souls. So 246 people were on the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. So it was day. They finally are seeing some light, and they can see a shore. And so when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves unto the sea, and loosed the rudder bands and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, so they were stuck basically on a rock. And the soldiers say, let's kill the prisoners in case they try and escape and swim off. Let's kill them. But what happened? Verse 23, but the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them for their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to the land. So again, remember it said in the beginning, Paul was giving unusual favor, and this by the centurion. And in the end, it was Paul's God who had saved those men. He forewarned them not to go because they were going to face danger. That was the first thing. Then he was given a word by God through an angel saying that they would all live and survive, but the ship would be wrecked. And just as they're getting close to shore, they're trying to kill him, but the centurion again comes to Paul's defense and says, no, we're not going to kill the prisoners. Those who can swim, you go to shore, and others who cannot, you're going to stay on the boards, and we're going to help get everyone across. And just like God's word said, everyone would survive. Not one hair on their head was touched, but the ship was wrecked. And that's exactly what took place. Is it good to serve a great God? It's so amazing. You know, you read that story and you think, wow, like if you really put it into context. I know I was reading the King James Version, and that was pretty tough on me, guys, as a whole. But when you really put it in context, God was moving powerfully for all of those men. But God had a purpose and a plan for Paul to go and share the gospel in Rome. And whatever he's called you to do, no man, no shipwreck, no wave, no nothing can stop you from where God wants to take you. And it just goes to show, trust in God, do as he says, be strong, be faithful in the things that he tells you, and just trust, have that childlike faith to believe in everything he's told you, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how challenging it can be. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for joining me. I will see you next week for the last book of Acts 28. So take care. Bye.